Anyone who knows me knows that I like to talk. I love good conversation. I like to talk about politics, economics, history, morality, religion. But don't worry, I'm not going to talk about any of those things today. I've been told just to talk about balance soil and who needs it, who we should be talking to. And when Hilda asked me that question, I started to think about the different groups of people that we come across who we should usefully talk to balance oil about. And it turns out that it's almost everybody. And the reason why everybody needs omega-3 fatty acids and polyphenols is they're the building blocks of health. They're the building blocks of your cells, your cell membranes, your metabolism, everything, really. These are pluripotent molecules. They do many different things in the bodies, but I'll talk primarily about the omega-3s. They do two very separate things, two groups of things. And one of the things that they do, which we don't talk very much about, is they help to stabilize cell membranes. Now, cell membranes are electrical, in a sense. Across the membrane, there is a voltage difference, and that's actually essential. It's what makes the membrane responsive, the fact that it is electrically active. That's how information, one of the ways in which information is transmitted. And one of the things that omega-3s do is once they're incorporated into the cell membranes, they make them less excitable. They have an effect on what are called voltage-gated ion channels. And these are holes in the membranes which are involved in the transport of electrolytes like sodium, magnesium, potassium. And they determine the voltage across the cell membrane and how reactive those cells are, how excitable they are. And this is one of the reasons why balanced oil has certain types of effects in the body. So, for example, it's well known, has been for a long time, that people who have a better 6-to-3 ratio, people who eat fish oil, are protected in some ways from certain types of heart disease. After a heart attack, they are less likely to go into a kind of arrhythmia, which is usually fatal unless it's caught early, called ventricular fibrillation, because the cells in the heart have got more omega-3s in the membranes, and they're less excitable. They're less likely to go into completely arrhythmic, irregular activity. But the same thing is true for other cells in the body, including smooth muscle, and this is one reason why if you have a better omega-3 status, the arteries are less contractile. The airways, if you have asthma, are less likely to constrict excessively. It's a good thing to have tissues that are a little bit less excitable. And the same thing is true in the brain, which is a very membrane-dependent organ. For example, in situations like epilepsy, where you're having excessive electrical activity in one or more areas of the brain, if you include the omega-3s into the cell membranes, and balanced oil is a very, very good way of doing just that, the neurons become less excitable. They fire less excessively. And of course, many of you who've seen cases where children or adults who have an epilepsy problem start taking balanced oil, and what we see is that in many cases the seizures become less. In many cases, those people become drug-free. I just heard about another case, a child who became completely drug-free and who's currently being investigated by a bewildered team of hospital doctors because his life has been absolutely transformed by taking balanced oil. There are many cases like this. The other thing this is one very valuable and very important set of properties that the omega-3s have, EPA and DHA. But then, of course, there is the anti-inflammatory capacity of the omega-3s together with the polyphenols that we add to our fish oil. Now, this little diagram, and the one that follows, talks about why it is that you need to have some inflammation. Not too much, not too little. You've got to be in that Goldilocks zone. Too much inflammation inevitably leads to progressive tissue damage, which is why it's now understood to be the key to chronic degenerative disease. If you do not have enough inflammation, that's a bad thing as well, because that means that you're not as well able to defend yourself against certain types of problems, such as infection by a bacterium or virus. When your immune system fights that off, it does so through a process of inflammation. You need to be able to do that. Once tissues have been damaged, for example, in an accident, you need to have the ability to mount an inflammatory response because that's part of the way in which you heal the damaged tissues. And if you look at this diagram, you'll see up at the top there, DAMPs, and there should be PAMPs as well, and there are damage-associated and pathogen-associated molecular patterns. Your immune cells recognize those things, and that triggers an inflammatory response that is physiological and helpful and appropriate. That's how you defend yourself, that's how you mend yourself. But this system can also be triggered in other ways as well. On the top left, what you'll see is something called RAGE, and that is the age receptor. What it responds to are advanced glycated end products, which are present in very large amounts in many processed foods. And if you're eating the wrong kinds of foods containing age compounds and ale compounds and other problematic compounds like that, it keeps on driving the inflammation sequence in a way that is not physiological at all. It's not helpful, it's excessive, and that inevitably, eventually leads to degenerative disease. Now, I'm not going to talk about in detail what happens inside the cell. This is an immune cell, in this case the macrophage. I'll talk about what happens outside the cell in this area called the inflammasome, not the some, for those scientists and doctors who are present. I'm going to talk about this as a two-phase sequence, an upper and a lower chamber, if you like. And in the upper chamber, the very important thing to know is that the omega-6s and the omega-3s play complementary roles. So you can see in the middle of the top bar the inflammatory challenge. That could be the pathogen, it could be physical damage, and you want to start an inflammatory reaction. It's important that you do that. That's how you defend yourself, that's how you mend. So you start the inflammation reaction with the omega-6s, specifically arachidonic acid. That starts the inflammation sequence. That's like the accelerator in your car. Once the challenge has been neutralized, you then need to stop the inflammation sequence, and that's where the omega-3s come in on the top right. And they produce compounds called, amongst other things, protectins and resolvins, and as the name implies, they stop the inflammation once it's done its job, and you go back to normal. So that's like the brake on the car. You need the accelerator and brake. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're driving in the busy streets of Stockholm or whether you're negotiating the multiple hazards of your daily life. You need to be able to switch this on and off. Now, this is the first phase of that inflammation sequence, and in this top phase, it's the 6-3 ratio that's really important, the accelerator and the brake. The problem is that we have a very, very excessive 6-3 ratio, thanks to the criminal irresponsibility of the multinational food companies who now control 80% of the global food space. And that means that the chemistry inside the cell is skewed in a way that makes that cell release exosomes, little structures that we used to call cell dust because we didn't think they were very organized. Now we know they are. They're actually packed full of information. And if you have a very high 6-3 ratio, the cell releases these particles and they break down, and this switches on the second phase of the inflammasome. They release enzymes called matrix metalloproteases. And these are extremely destructive enzymes. They destroy the extracellular matrix, the collagen, the elastin fibers, many other types of fibers that hold all your cells together, organizing them and allowing them to function collectively as a tissue or an organ. Now, because these enzymes are so destructive, we have to keep them in check. And if you're eating a healthy diet, a diet like the one that we co-evolved with, you're eating large amounts of polyphenols, far larger than occur in the modern diet. And these polyphenols inhibit those enzymes and keep them under control. So here's part of the problem. The food industry gives us foods with a very high 6-3 ratio. And that means that the first part of this inflammatory sequence is overheating. And then the second thing that happens is, if you're eating modern foods, they've taken a lot of the polyphenols away. So the second part of that sequence is overheating. You're releasing these enzymes all the time into your bones, your joints, your arteries, inside your brain, and they dissolve this matrix, this mesh of microfibers that is holding all of your cells together. The omega-3s and the polyphenols in balance oil stop the first sequence and the second sequence. Fish oil is simply not very effective on its own. Polyphenols are not very effective on their own unless you eat them in very large amounts. It's when you combine the two, that's when the magic happens. That's when the inflammation sequence becomes controlled. And that's what you've seen for yourselves, many of you, when people with very problematic symptoms, diseases of civilization, they use this type of product, our products, and their symptoms start to fade, their diseases go into remission, and then very many of them start to heal, and many of them eventually become drug-free. Many of you have seen this for yourselves. So this is where Balance Oil comes in. So who needs it? Well, actually, it turns out there's very few people who don't. And I'm going to quickly go through the life stages and show what Balance Oil is offering to people in these different sectors who have very specific age-related problems. So let's start at conception. Well, one of the problems with conception is it's becoming increasingly difficult because male and female infertility is becoming very prevalent. Some of you who've seen my talks have shown me present a slide looking at, for example, sperm counts, which have fallen by almost 2/3 in the last generation alone. We know that in this problem, diet plays a very major role. We know that inflammatory stress reduces fertility, and poor diet is very much a part of that. We know conversely that a good diet containing larger amounts of omega-3s and polyphenols, an anti-inflammatory diet, is associated very strongly with improved male and female fertility. And one of the reasons for this is that the process of sperm formation and egg formation you can think of as a kind of very controlled inflammatory sequence. Too much inflammation disrupts that process. But there's structural things going on here too. We know that DHA, the fatty acid, is itself built into the head of the human spermatozoa. We know that omega-3s lead to improved sperm quality, quantity, morphology, and movement. And we know that they improve oocyte quality. These are this is what gives rise to the ovum and extends fertility. At least in preclinical studies, there is some clinical evidence for this too. And we know the polyphenols play a similar role. So the mechanism kind of fits. It fits the epidemiology. For people who are trying to conceive, Balance Oil, I think, is actually a very important part of a fertility-enhancing program. During pregnancy and lactation, I think you all know that the developing fetal brain in the third trimester, perhaps the beginning, the end of the second trimester, and in the first year after birth, it's developing. It needs large amounts of DHA, but it needs EPA too. But for the mum as well, it's a pretty good thing to have Balance Oil because we know that omega-3s reduce the risk of preterm labor and delivery. Now, because the fetal brain really needs these omega-3s, if the mother's diet doesn't include significant amounts of fish oil, and she doesn't have enough of these omega-3 fatty acids, the baby will steal them from her. If there isn't enough in the plasma, the baby will actually steal these fatty acids from the mother's brain, where they're stored. And so we see that in mothers who don't have good nutritional status to begin with, their brain actually shrinks in the last trimester because the infant is pulling all the omega-3s it can out of the reserve of its mother's brain so it can use them for itself. And this is implicated in what is known as baby brain. For those mothers who are in this situation, they become more forgetful. They actually lose a few IQ points. The brain is actually shrinking. And it's very connected also to pre- and postnatal depression. So Balance Oil is a good thing for the developing baby. It's a good thing for the mum as well. And there is good work now. Some of this was done by people who are linked to my institute, the Institute of Food, Brain and Behavior. Professor Michael Crawford did a lot of this early work, one of my heroes. And he showed that giving omega-3s to very young infants, especially preemies, premature infants, helped them with visual and cognitive development. This is recognized by ISFAL guidelines, and they say that during pregnancy and lactation, mums should be taking at least 300 milligrams of DHA per day. EPA is also important. I think it's actually not a very good idea using these as omega-3s individually. And moving seamlessly on to toddlers and teenagers, their problems are a little different. For those of you who have a toddler or a teenager at home, you know that these subhuman creatures can be really problematic. Mood swings, poor impulse control, all kinds of issues like that. And what we do know is that omega-3s, and to some extent the polyphenols, can help. They improve impulse control. And this has been shown in a number of controlled studies now, one of which again comes from my institute. Bernard Gesh, one of my colleagues, did this study at one of the British prisons. It was then repeated in a Dutch prison. Other work is going on at the moment, showing that these omega-3s, when combined with other types of micronutrients, had a really dramatic effect in reducing antisocial, aggressive, and violent behavior in youth and young adult prisoners. And it does the same thing in free-range teenagers as well, exactly the same thing. We know also that because the omega-3s are built into your brain cells, including the macroneurons that we know are important in summing different types of information so you can form a gestalt understanding, we know that in cases of children who have neurodevelopmental problems such as ADD, ADHD, dysphasia, dyspraxia, and all the rest of them, there's quite a large literature now showing that the omega-3s can be very helpful in these cases. And what we know from our own experience is that if we use balance oil in types of cases like this and combine it with xenobiotic, because in many of these cases there is a dysbiosis, we get super additive benefits. And again, I hear repeatedly, week after week, of very, very difficult cases who effectively are normalized by this combination of nutrient inputs. This has led to ISFAL guidelines again for infants from 1 to 18 months, 32 milligrams a pound of EPA and DHA, and for children from 1.5 to 15 years, 15 milligrams of EPA and DHA as well. Moving on to adults, a different category. Well, adults might not think that they need omega-3s, especially if they feel that they're healthy, but the problem is it's very hard now to find a healthy adult. You can tell this by looking at our appalling public health profiles. The multiple pandemics of chronic degenerative diseases, which we know are driven by chronic inflammation. We know that by the time you get into your, let's say, 60s or 70s, the odds are very high that you will have one of those conditions, if not more than one, and you'll be receiving medical treatment for them. But the point to make here is that all of these conditions, which are driven by inflammation, and they're known as inflammaging, we know that they're more and more common. We know that they're emerging in younger groups of patients. We see this happening right across the board. And it's happening to such an extent now that life expectancy is starting to fall in different countries around the world. We know that life expectancy has been falling for the last 4 years in the United States, for the last 3 years in the United Kingdom, and on current projections is going to fall another 4 years in the United States and another 3 years in the UK in the next 30 years. We're going down. We're going south. Everything is bad now, and it's getting worse. And we're also seeing very similar falls in life and in health expectancy in many other parts of the world. So in China, where westernization is taking a terrible toll, the same thing is happening in India, same thing is happening in Germany, in Poland, in Ireland. We're seeing vulnerable groups, what we call bellwether groups, showing exactly the same decline in life and health expectancy. Now, here is the point. Now, these conditions all have long, latent preclinical periods. So you can be forming atheroma in your arteries for 3 or 4 decades before your first heart attack. You can be losing bone for 30 or 40 years before the first fracture. The cartilage in your joints is thinning for a quarter century, if not more, before you realize that you have osteoarthritis. You get the point. For most of the course of these diseases, they're invisible. They're under the surface, where you don't know, and of course your doctors don't know because you're not presenting to your doctor. And we know this not only theoretically, but we know this objectively too, because when we study groups of young to middle-aged adults who think that they're healthy, what we find is when we look at them carefully, they already have the early signs of these diseases. They already have fatty streaks in the linings of their arteries. They're already developing coronary artery disease. We know that many of these so-called healthy young to middle-aged adults have osteopenia. They're starting to lose bone mineral density. They're already moving towards progressive liver disease. They're already starting to lose their brain cells. They have age-related cognitive decline. Not yet dementia, but they're moving there. They haven't noticed it yet. They're not diagnosed, but when we look for these conditions using very specific analytical tools, we find almost everybody has the seeds, the preclinical forms of one or more than one of these chronic degenerative diseases. And here's the point. If we can stop this excessive inflammation, we can stop the diseases from ever becoming clinical. So the population that thinks that it's healthy, that thinks that it's well-nourished, we know that they're not. We know they're already ill, they just don't yet know it. And Balance Oil and our other products are the tools that they need to prevent them from becoming clinically unwell. Oh, thank you. So for them, Balance Oil is all about prevention. But once you get to the point of being an elder, gray-haired like me, in our age group, 60s, 70s and beyond, chronic degenerative disease is a reality. It's progressed to the point where it is now causing symptoms, so this is a more easy way to approach it. These people have problems, they know they have problems, they want solutions. They're not that happy with the pharmaceutical strategies, which, as you now know, are entirely non-curative, only treat symptoms, and in the process kill a lot of patients. You know, medical intervention is actually a leading cause of death in the United States and in Europe now. The tools that we use are specific, expensive, very selective, treat symptoms only, and do a lot of damage. What we do is much more potent, much more therapeutic, much safer. They have active degenerative disease, they're losing life expectancy, but more than that, they're losing health expectancy. So the way that we eat now, the way that we live now, the way that we die now, we spend the last 10% of our lives becoming progressively more medically dependent, becoming progressively more expensive. We die slowly and expensively, and there's a huge increase in health and social costs, which rises exponentially in the last decade or so of our lives. In cases like this, elder people who actually have clinical disease, by reducing inflammation, what we can do is reduce the progress of their disorders, their problem. What we can do is to reduce the symptoms. We can reduce the progress. In many cases, we can bring it into an equilibrium. In many cases, what we see is a fundamental reassertment of normal metabolism, allowing the processes of tissue healing and regeneration to come to the fore. In many cases, we see even patients who have progressed to the point where they have clinical symptoms, what we see is that gradually they become drug-free. So Balance Oil, in this particular group, helps people to live a lot better. And along with that, if you're living better, if your organs and systems are no longer being compromised and progressively damaged, along with that, as a secondary attribute, comes enhanced life expectancy. That's not necessarily what we're striving for to begin with. We're more about better quality of life. But life expectancy comes along with that. So Balance Oil is really for everyone. And we know that all the omega-3s in the marine food system don't come from fish, they come from the deep cold water marine plants that produce the omega-3s. That's what gets into the krill, and then into the fish, into the mammals, and then into man. So why don't we just cut the middle fish, cut the middleman, and go straight to the seaweed? We can do that too for vegans and vegetarians. We have the vegan Balance Oil, as you know, which also contains SDA and GLA, two fatty acids I haven't talked about much so far, but they have interesting and anti-inflammatory properties of their own. We don't use the algal oil pure because not everybody likes the taste of the polyphenols that these seaweeds use, so instead we substitute them with polyphenols from olive, which have very similar characteristics. That is what causes the multiple benefits of Balance Oil. So the question then is not who is it who needs Balance Oil, who is it that Balance Oil could help, but who doesn't need it? It's actually almost a universal truth and a universal need. The only people who don't need this are people who are eating a really healthy diet, which is hardly anyone anymore. We didn't evolve with supplements. We didn't need supplements when we were still living in the Stone Age. Supplements are pretty modern. And some nutritionists say, well, we don't need these. All you need to do is eat a healthy diet. That's true. If you're leading a physically active lifestyle, running at about, say, 3,000 to 7,000 calories a day, and eating only unprocessed foods, which are calorie light and nutrient dense. But if you're living in a town or a city, if you have a white-collar occupation, if your calorific requirements are only about 2,000 calories a day, and that's pretty standard now, you cannot get all the nutrients you need, even from a well-balanced diet. It's no longer possible. And if you've made the mistake of including processed and ultra-processed foods in your diet, which are calorie-dense and nutrient-light, you certainly can't. So, yeah, who doesn't need supplements these days? I think almost everybody does. And I think you're in a position to help a lot of people. People who have problems that the current healthcare system cannot help. We are living between two millstones, between a food manufacturing system that is feeding us toxic foods, which create chronic degenerative diseases, which then sends us running to the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry is very grateful to the food industry for continually supplying them with customers. And the food industry is equally grateful to the pharmaceutical industry for keeping all the rest of us doped up with drugs that dull the pain and the symptoms of the intoxication that the modern diet creates. We're being crushed between these two millstones. It's not personal, it's just business. What we have is the key. We can open the gates and let everyone out. You can give everyone a much, much better life. I'm so sorry, I'm over time. This has been very general. If you would like to know more about the detail, for any doctors and scientists here, please have a look at my blog. That's drpaulclayton.eu. Or read my book. This is now available in every language in Europe. So it's Let Your Food Be Your Pharmaconutrition. Or Lass deine Ernährung deine Pharmakonutrition sein. And it's also in French and Dutch, Italian, everything else. Have a look at it, and then let me know what's wrong. Thank you.